You had the big AI CEOs originally saying that AI would cause job disruption, and that, you've even had some of the CEOs more recently saying work will become optional in a world of super intelligence. At the same time, we have robotics coming over the horizon. So you've got this sort of convergence of intelligence, and then, I don't know, you could think of it like muscles, like physical
Yep.
muscles or ability. At the same time, we're seeing AI accelerate in its capabilities. What does this mean for the average person and their job, and who's going to benefit from this AI revolution in your point of view?
It means that you will either be cutting edge and capable, and among that top fraction of a percent down to 10% of the population who is cutting edge and using it and accelerating, or you will, if you're in a thinking job, be at risk of being replaced. We're coming into a world where we can automate everything. The evolution of man was, we had the agricultural era, and there was no real inventiveness. And then man invented the machine. And what the machine did is it replaced man's physical necessity. So men used to be like oxen in the agricultural field and so on, and they were replaced by tractors. And then we entered the industrial age. First, you had the printing press that allowed people to learn. And then you had these inventions, the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution. And what you had is the replacing the physical that man would do in factories then and so on. And so the way I look at it is I look at the human body and I see like it's replacing the body and so on. And it's coming up higher and higher, and then it replaces some aspects of the mind that you can computerize. And it's coming up, and it's replacing higher and higher levels of thinking and reasoning, okay? So that path is part of the evolutionary path that is happening, okay? So then you start to say, what do I have to offer? And so in answer to who benefits from it, those who benefit from it are those who are the capitalists with the ideas that replace the workers. And so if you look at, there's revenue for businesses. When you buy something in a store, there's revenue, okay? And if you look at the share that is going to workers, you see that share going down. And if you look at the share that's going to those who own that business, that share is going up. That's, how do they share that revenue in terms of the cost? And you see that that's rising. And so this is an evolutionary process. And it's true that what happens is you get more free time, okay? So now the society has to think, how do I deal with this? So for example, the work week, which used to be, a 60 or 70-hour work week, goes down to less than a 40-hour work week, and there's more time. But there needs to be, how do you create a bottom? And so we're going through this phase in which there is this upper end that is making incredible amounts of wealth, as we described, and then this lower end that is then having these challenges. We have a relatively good economy, and the difficulty of college graduates to get employment has increased significantly. And I can tell you that in many businesses, it becomes more of a pain in the neck to have a college graduate, let's say, do it. You have to train them, you have to, and many of those tasks, many of that thing can be done very quickly with the AI and with computerization. And as you get into robotics, you're going to have that happen, right?
The speed of the disruption that we're seeing, because of the amount of capital that's flowing into these AI frontier models like the Anthropics and OpenAI, et cetera, is quite different from anything else, sort of the historical precedences we've seen through the Industrial Revolution, where it took time to build the tractors.
There's an element of speed. What happens usually is the bubble bursts, and now you have the cyclical dynamic of that while the technology evolves. But the supply demand and the debt problem that we just talked about then come in. And so unemployment is due to typically some sort of a combination of a financial crisis that, like we talked about, the debt and stocks going down and people not having collateral and then therefore not buying assets, and that dynamic that causes the unemployment rate, that factor.
That's the sort of economic reasons. But in terms of the AI agents, robotics being able to replace you, I've sat with Dara from Uber, and Dara said that he imagines in the future, the 9 million riders that they have around the world doing deliveries will be replaced by autonomous vehicles, autonomous robots. Those 9 million drivers' careers that you have will be out of work, conceivably, in the, talking about being honest about the situation.
Yeah, I think, again, it goes to physical AI as well, right? So I think 20 years from now, you can imagine that those 9 million will be 20 million AVs maybe. But we have time between now and then, partially because we don't operate in the virtual world, right? We operate in the physical world. You have to get the regulations up. You have to build the cars. You have to build the sensor stacks. The models have to get there. So there is time between now and then, but you can imagine the majority of our trips being fulfilled by robots of some kind.
The unemployment rate gets very influenced by the bubble bursting and the economy going down. You see that spike.
Mhm.
You certainly have the evolutionary change that you're referring to.
Okay, so it's
Okay.
both.
In other words, there's this evolutionary thing in which they, like he says, the tractor replaces the laborer, or the assembly line worker as technology is replaced. And that is an evolutionary thing that goes continuously for, many years, and in the way that you're describing. Because you asked about the unemployment rate, I just wanted to emphasize that the unemployment rate is very heavily affected by that bubble bursting.
So, okay, you've got two forces at once then. You've got when the bubble bursts, everybody, as we said, needs cash. So they start cutting their costs. So that's when they start laying people off.
Yeah.
They start looking around their company and go, forget growth, we just need to survive. So we're going to lay off that team and that team and that team. And then you see unemployment going up. And then you've got this sort of underlying shift happening at the same time, which is workers are replacing their team members with AI agents or robotics, or in the factories, they're now using robots to do factory work, etc. And that's the sort of current slow march forward.
Right. So I have this chart. Okay. What this represents, this line, is the evolution of technologies. In other words, we have greater and greater learning and doing things better. And that's the evolution that we're talking about, that also machines replace people or replace their tags over that period of time. Then you have this big cycle, which is typically lasts for about a lifetime on average, about 80 years. We went through that last time, 1945. There are orders. There's a monetary order, there's a domestic political order, there's a geopolitical order. Okay. You have the bubble bursting. Okay. You have this. This is what we're talking about, that dive. And then when you go through that, you break down these orders. And when they break down, then you would get rid of the debt burden. So you get rid of the monetary system as you're used to it. You may get rid of the domestic order. Many countries' orders, their systems end. I mean, they all end at some point. And so they can break down quite often in a time of great internal conflict. Does the system last? And that happens at that time. And so that's that big breakdown. But still, what you're talking about is, and I agree with you, this keeps going up, okay? Because learning, you don't unlearn what you've learned. So as this goes up, and you still keep this thing going up, okay? But you have the big cycle, the debt, the conflict type of movement. And these little cycles are the cycles that we see in this roughly, on average, let's call it an 80-year period. But you see the recession, and recession has higher unemployment, and so on. Then they stimulate monetary policy, they make money looser, then the economy goes up and you have prosperity. Then you go into a bubble, okay, and you run lower on capacity because you're using up the capacity. Inflation rises, they tighten monetary policy, and then you have the recession that follows. So these movements from one recession to the next recession, that cycle that I've just described, on average has lasted about 6 years, give or take about 3. So that's the way it looks.
So I'll play this back to make sure I understand it. There is a sort of bigger macro bubble, which is over 80 years, which is the changing of the world order.
Yep, you get deeper and deeper and deeper in debt over a lifetime. So let's say your debt capacity, you have a certain amount. So the government's debt capacity, for example, it can borrow, when you wipe it out here, then you can build it up until it starts to squeeze. Debt service starts to squeeze out.
And that's a changing of the world order.
That is one of the ingredients, right? So, okay, we have too much debt. At the same time, what you're building up is you're building up great wealth gaps, because capitalism, and I love capitalism, but here's the reality. It creates big differences in income and wealth. And when it does that, that also creates differences in people's opportunities, because the rich people can educate their children well, and they can give them all the benefits. I mean, education is a big benefit, and that's why there should be broad-based, excellent education. But all of that happens, and so you see wealth gaps build up. So like the Industrial Revolution leads into the Gilded Age, okay? The Gilded Age looks a lot like now, people buying expensive things and looking very gilded. And then it leads to the robber barons. And the robber barons are people who are considered, that they're taking advantage, the billionaire class, and it becomes that cycle. So that's the way it works.
So you've got this 80-year sort of, boom, and then there's a collapse, which sort of ends in conflict and the changing of the New World Order. And then within there, you have these little bubbles, which are really economic bubbles that go up and down. Recession, people get very excited, they contract, they get excited, they contract. And then you have the straight line here, which is the sort of technological improvement across the spectrum of ideas and technologies and all these things.
It keeps going.
And it keeps going regardless of this boom and bust, because, as you say, people never forget. So a couple of questions on this then. I don't even know which one to dive into first, but let's go for, I guess, just closing off on the last point that I was getting at, is there's this narrative that there'll be new jobs created because of AI and robotics and everyone will be fine. A lot of this narrative comes from Silicon Valley.
Who is producing the technology that doesn't want to be attacked because they're
making a lot of money.
They may have an
and they're in the Gilded Age.
desire to have a certain perspective. I think objective people in Silicon Valley, and there are a number of them, would say it's going to have a big employment. But you can see it in the wealth. Who owns stocks and who doesn't own stocks? Okay, now if you own stocks, you're very happy now. Okay, and if you don't own stocks, you're not getting the benefit of owning stocks. So that in and of itself creates a greater wealth, even aside from employment. Okay, so there are these forces to create the greater wealth gaps, right?
Roughly 61% of US adults own stock in some form, and most of them hold it indirectly through their retirement plan. Only 20% of Americans directly own individual stocks or shares through a brokerage account, while over half of Americans own stocks. Ownership is heavily concentrated. The top 10% of households hold almost 90% of the stock. How do you feel about this narrative coming from predominantly Silicon Valley, that there'll be new jobs created that we can't yet forecast and everyone will be fine? They point to the Industrial Revolution. They say, look, when the tractors came, we thought everyone was finished. When factories came, we thought everyone was finished. But look, we figured some other stuff out.
Because if you look at that, this is this thing I'm saying, that as your body is more and more replaced with your mind, then you can do that. But when your mind is replaced and your body is replaced, what is it that you have to sell?
What is it that we have to sell as humans once our body and our minds are replaced?
What man has is emotions and has intuitions. There are certain things that artificial intelligence doesn't have. And so if you have to get down to what those things are, does the robot give a good massage? Does, what is it that is left? And so we will wrestle with what it is that is left, okay? But I think that for the foreseeable future, those who can work very well where they have an exceptional human intelligence and work in partnership with the artificial intelligence, that they are going to be at the cutting edge of all of this.